Hello and welcome to this new module called Get More with Less. So this is going to be an entire video about the 80-20 rule. Arguably one of the things which has changed my life for the most, because you can literally apply this anywhere. It's not just about productivity or about business, but you can really use this in pretty much every single area of your life. So what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to cover what is the actual 80-20 rule. Then we're going to see why this will change your life, because I firmly believe it will, because it has for me too. Then we're going to cover some exercises and also look at fractal and negative 80-20, which are two variants of this rule. And lastly, also some common mistakes that you want to avoid when using this model. So firstly, the 80-20 rule is basically a rule that states, and I won't go into the entire scientific reasoning behind why this is, but there was an Italian guy called Pareto, I'm not sure what his first name was, and he discovered that basically 20% of the causes create 80% of the effects. And also 20% of efforts usually create 80% of the outcomes and 20% of things. That's kind of the sort of framework we can understand from this, is that 20% of things will create 80% of other things. That's how this rule works. And some practical examples: 20% of tasks create 80% of your productivity, 20% of books create 80% of the wisdom. Because I'm sure that you have read many books which don't seem to be that useful at all, and there's a lot of them. 20% of friends create 80% relationship benefits. I'm sure you have a pretty large friends group, and maybe not all of them give you the same sense of connection as a few do. And also 20% of exercises create 80% of muscle growth. I'm sure that you have done your fair share of workouts and experienced that the kind of accessory movements, although can be useful, and especially if you're into bodybuilding, definitely recommend it, they won't contribute too much to your overall muscle growth. So those are some practical examples. Now, why this rule will change your life. And that's because billionaires and other successful people use it all the time. So there's a lot of sort of definitions for this rule. It's also called the essential few, the vital few, essentialism, 80-20. Those are kind of the overarching terms. But really what it comes down to, and the reason that a lot of successful people, which I will put on the screen right now, see this as one of the most important things out there, it's just because we have to become very good at prioritizing. As you can see on the screen, people like Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett's business partner, Rockefeller, Ray Dalio, self-made billionaire. I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not sure if Rockefeller was a billionaire, but 4 out of these 6 people are billionaires, and they praise this rule. So I hope you can also see why this is extremely important to understand. Okay, so the reason that this rule is so important is because it gives you a huge amount of leverage. Why? Well, if you think about what your goal is basically just an effect. What I mean is something has to be put in motion in order to create the effect. A cause must happen in order to create the effect, which is your goal. So if you put in the causes or the actions in place to create 80% of the effect, which is your goal, that means you're going to win. And the sooner you're able to find out which causes or which actions those are, the faster you will make progress. To give you an example, let's say there's 2 people, one which just decides to work twice as hard because they think that if they do twice as much, they will achieve twice as much. This was me in the beginning. I thought that if I just worked twice as much, if I just did twice as much, I would achieve twice as much the result, which, obviously is a way to do it. That's not the wrong way. In my opinion, it is the wrong way, but it's definitely okay. And the smarter thing to do in this case would be to actually use the 80-20 rule. So instead of working 80 hours to double your inputs, you can identify the essential 20%. This makes sure that you save not only the time that you use to spend on health, leisure, or relationships, because if you have to work 40 extra hours per week, you're going to have to make some sacrifices. Whereas the only sacrifice I see with the 80-20 rule is the mental effort required to prioritize. And I also did forget quite an important element, and that is what you sacrifice with the 80-20 rule is doing less of what doesn't work. So for example, Steve Jobs, when he rejoined Apple in the late 90s, because he left it because they were not, I think, on the same page. And then he got back and he cut, I think, about 80% or 90% of the entire product line of Apple. And he remained just with the iPhone and the iPad. So you can really see that Steve Jobs had to make a sacrifice, because Apple could never succeed with 40 different products. If they just focused their attention on 2, make those extremely good, they would see success. And the rest is history, of course. The only cost for the left will be the physical effort, because you have to put in twice as much, versus on the right, the mental effort, which is used to identify the essential 20. Because, identifying it is literally 80% of the work already done. If you can find what you have to do, you just have to do it. That's as easy as that. So that means you get like 2,000 as much leverage as if you would get just working harder. And nowadays there's a huge amount of information available, which means if you don't stick to what's essential, you'll be lost in the sea of information. And I can see this happening already. So it can also be applied to any area of your life, not just productivity, like I just mentioned. And this is why I think this rule is extremely important. So let's cover some exercises. But before we start, there's actually 2 things you have to do. And to be completely honest, if you're just watching this video and you don't have any sort of notepad with you, or you don't intend on taking action, none of this stuff I'm going to teach you today is going to matter. Because then you're just consuming it for the sake of feeling productive. But there's a very big difference between feeling productive and being productive. So right now, just grab a pen and paper, and I want you to do 2 things. First of all, write down what is your goal. And you can pick a specific area in your life. It doesn't have to be business, doesn't have to be work. It can be something like health or relationships. Then ask yourself, what are you trying to find 80/20 for? Those are the 2 things we need. Because if you cannot take the actions required to see positive change with new things that you learn, you're essentially just watching information for the sake of it. And this is something I'm really against, so I hope you do see the point of just taking action immediately. So to give you a couple of examples, could be improve your health, make more money, or just improve your work. And some examples of what you could be trying to find 80/20 for could be diet, could be exercise, earning more money, spending money. So what I mean is like, I need to find the 80/20 of things which make up my spending is what I mean. Productivity, so increasing that, and writing if you do that as your business. And let's take productivity as an example, which is quite relevant to this course. So let's say that your goal is to become more productive, and you're trying to find the 20% of things that create 80% of the productivity. Well, there's 4 things. If you actually Google like essential few productivity, you'll find it pretty quickly. It's going to be time management. So how do you manage your time? What sort of time blocks are you using? How often are you taking breaks? Focus. So are you doing one thing at a time? What are you focusing on? Hence the reason that Steve Jobs cut out everything, because he needed to focus. Energy is one of the most overlooked and most important things, because if you don't have energy, then you're never going to be able to put as much work into it as someone who does have a lot of energy. And prioritization, which is pretty much what this entire course is about. So that last one is going to be settled for you. Probably the other courses are going to cover some of the other things like time management, focus, and energy, but that's for a lot of time. So just work on improving these 3 things. It's honestly so simple, because people out here trying to find the best productivity hacks, trying to buy supplements, trying to do all this crazy stuff. But the only thing you really need to do is just make sure that you block out your time properly, focus on one thing, do it with good energy, so sleep well, eat well, and prioritize the most important things so you can actually get stuff done. That's it. So that's why this rule is so important. And also, let's take business as an example. Let's say your goal is to get to $10,000 per month, and you're trying to find the 20% of actions which will create 80% of the revenue, which is a very smart thing to do in the beginning. So the goal is obviously money. So how do we actually get money? By selling stuff. Should be pretty obvious. So how do you sell stuff? By doing sales. Also pretty obvious. So you can see that even though you might think this is obvious, the only thing that you really should be worried about is just making sales. And I can guarantee you right now, if your goal is 10K a month and you're not thinking about sales every day, that is your problem. So it might seem obvious, but if your goal is to get 10K a month and you're spending most of your time on other things like building websites, like building products, don't get me wrong, you have to build products, but it's not the main thing. You're just not going to get there as fast if you focus on other things. So yeah, I just covered this. What is it? If it's like product or content, and those are important as well, but those are really like the 80% which make up 20% of the result. So that's kind of like the inverse approach, which is not what we want. But you do still have to do those. Don't neglect those. That's not what I'm saying. And also this results in much less leverage, because if you do things which account for 20% of the result, you're just going to wait for things to eventually start kicking in, which is going to take ages if you focus your stuff on the 80%, which creates 20% of the result. So I hope you can see how this works. And an action item for you, just pick 3 areas in your life right now you want to improve. So it could be business, could be writing, it could be productivity, it could be relationships, whatever. Because it's fun and all for you to watch this video, but you're never going to actually benefit from it if you don't apply it to your life. So just pick 3 areas. Doesn't have to be complicated. Next, for those 3 areas, list what you're trying to find the 80-20 for. So is it going to be productivity? Is it going to be the diet, the exercise, the sleep? What is it going to be? And I have a really detailed examples sheet for you, which you can check in the resources section. And I will be walking you through that at the end of the video. So don't worry if you want to wait with that for a little bit. Okay, and now let's cover fractal and negative 80-20, because there's 2 things which you can use about this rule which make it a lot more efficient. The first one is fractal 80-20. This states that 20% of the 20%, which would equal 4%, creates 80% of the final results. So which would include 64%. And if we take as an example sales, what is the 20% that will create the result within the 20%? So kind of like, what is the 4% that will create the 64%? If we take a look at this, we can see that it's going to be taking sales calls, because how can you ever make high ticket sales? I'm talking about high ticket sales here. If you don't have people to talk to on a call, you're just not going to do it. So that's the 20% within the 20% you should have your focus on. Or let's say productivity. Let's say we want to find the 20% that will create a result within the 20%. So within those 4 which I just covered, if I quickly just scroll back here, within time management, focus, and prioritization, which one do you think is going to be the 20% of 20%? Because if you can identify that, you make progress even quicker. And to give it away, you might already guess it. It's also the reason that I'm making this course, because it's prioritization or prioritizing. Because if you know how to focus, but you focus on the wrong thing, you're never going to get there. If you know how to manage your time, but you manage your time for something which doesn't do anything, then it doesn't matter. And if you have a lot of energy, but you channel that energy into the wrong things, it doesn't matter. So your first and utmost priority, funnily enough, should be prioritizing, which is why I started with this course. And also negative 80-20. So I just covered this about the fractal 80-20, kind of like, you can even take this a step further, by the way. You can identify within prioritization what could be the top one. And I would say probably 80-20 is within prioritization one of the 20% models, which creates 80% of the results with prioritization. So you can see how far you can take this. And there's also the negative 80-20, which states that 20% of the actions create 80% of the negative return. For example, with your health, the 20% that creates the 80% of negative return is going to be bad food or junk food, sugar and alcohol primarily, but also bad sleep. I should have definitely included bad sleep here, because that's probably a lot higher on the list. Now, so common mistakes to sum it up. Firstly, thinking that it's always exactly 80-20. So the entire rule of this is just to understand that few things create many outputs. So there's a few things which you do which create most of the outputs. It's not always 80-20. It can also be something like 10-90 or 40-60, doesn't have to be exact. And also a mistake is over applying it. So let's say that you are using this for every single thing in your business, for every single task, every single day, every single minute. You're going to drive yourself crazy. So be sure that you use this rule, use it a lot, but don't overuse it. And lastly, enjoyment, because sometimes people might be overly obsessed with using this specific model, and as a result of that, ignore the things that give them enjoyment, because it's not part of the 80-20. For example, if you have a specific diet plan and you really enjoy a certain type of snack, If it's not in your 80-20 list, it doesn't mean you should cut it out if you genuinely enjoy it. So be sure that you don't exclude things which you genuinely enjoy. Now, lastly, let's cover some resources. Firstly, I'm going to share with you the action steps. Then I'm going to cover a cheat sheet which you can use, which contains a bunch of different categories where you can use the 80-20 rule. So you can download them. I think it's below this video. All right, so how to get more with less. The action steps you want to do whenever you're going to use this is first defining what's your goal, then what you're trying to find 80-20 for, what is the 20% that creates 80% of the results, and what's the 20% that creates 80% of the negative results. And optionally, you can also identify the fractal 80-20, 20% within 20 that creates the 80 or 64% of results. And lastly, make sure to prioritize these 20% of tasks which come as a result of this exercise, and don't neglect the rest. That's a big mistake we've covered. All right, and there's a quick worksheet here for you to fill it out if you would like. And lastly, we also have a cheat sheet. I do want to give a quick shout out to Michael Simmons because he was an inspiration for a lot of these things. And there's a small little sort of meta hack here because I did actually not fill out all of the answers. Why? Well, first, some of these will be personal. Secondly, I've looked at the 20% which will improve my life right now by 80%. And funnily enough, I also applied the 80-20 rule to the 80-20 cheat sheet. So you can see how far you can take this. Now, it's your turn to figure out what 20% of things will improve your life by 80%. So I don't recommend that you actually go through all of this and start filling all of this out. First of all, it's going to take an immense amount of time. Second of all, it's not worth it because there's only about 20% of things right now which will improve your life by 80%. My guess is probably going to be work, learning, and money, and health for most. Something like industries might be more interesting if you have a big business, but let's just cover the basics. So this basically includes a bunch of categories for an area with a question corresponding and some of my answers in here as well. So feel free to just look at these and use them as inspiration, but the best thing is to just come up with your own answers because I haven't done a lot of research about these possible answers. It's kind of just what I came up with, but I do think that some of these will be helpful for you, especially this one, for example. So I hope you find this useful. You'll be able to download these resources below this video. And if you have any questions, you can let me know. And I hope you enjoyed the model. And yeah, then I will see you in the next one.